This class is going to happen again next fall. So I'm handing out papers with some potential topics that we're going to have a class on. So you can sort of circle one that if you like it. It's not like going to be a vote where it's like the most votes I'm going to then eventually pick, but I want to sort of see where people are leaning and then based on what I sort of want to do. And I'm also going to present these handouts to the church as well, to other people to see if other people are interested in. I can just hand you one, Bill. But I'll go over each one.
Don't forget the microphone is here for questions.
And
anyone? Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's fine.
Again, you don't have to give these to me till the end of the class, or you can give them to me on Sunday if I see you at church. So the first one is a continuation of natural theology. That would be basically very similar to this class. If you remember this class, and if you've missed some of it, we covered 3 arguments for God's existence, and then 1 argument against God's existence. If we did the same thing in the fall, it would be similar. There's more arguments for God's existence. There's more arguments against. So I think it would be like similar structure. I go through 3 more arguments. So it'd be very similar to this. The second one, I was going to actually do this one in this like group of classes, was arguments and evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The reason I didn't is just because there's a lot of info and I couldn't fit it into one class, so it'd actually be a whole topic on that. So probably like 8 to 10 classes. If you remember, we did one class basically on objections to belief in God. It was sort of like a one class. We had them all written on the board. There was a lot we didn't get to. People seemed very interested in that. So again, that could be a whole, 10 class. That could go for like 10 classes. We could really get in depth on some of the objections, really go into them a lot. I also did sort of a half class on comparative religion. We could do a whole 10-week course on that and cover different religions more in depth, deal with some of the questions people might have about other religions. And then the 5th one would be a study of some select Christian doctrines. I thought we'd have some of the newer people here that I thought this class might be good for. But again, what this is like, study the doctrine of like creation, the doctrine of salvation, and not so much, people hear the word doctrine and they think like, oh, this is law. And I don't mean, it's not like that. It's not like I'm saying this is the doctrine, this is what you have to believe, but it's sort of a study of the doctrine of creation. Like, for example, in creation, you have young earth creationists, you have old earth creationists. How does evolution play into creation? Does evolution disprove creation? Things like that. If you remember one of the early classes, I discussed the Trinity. I only spent like 15 minutes on it, but again, I would go more in depth. So it would be like an in-depth study of some Christian doctrines that maybe you sort of have heard your whole life, but then you've never really sort of deeply understood it. So we could like dive in deep on some of them. So again, you can think about this. You can take it home if you want to hand it in to me on a later date. Think about what you sort of want to study. But again, we're going to be doing this class again in the fall. It might start a little sooner, so we might do more. So it might go like September to March. This is probably going to be the last class of this year just because it's getting warmer. The church has a softball team that's on Friday nights. It's going to be playing soon. So if you missed any, you can go back and listen. Tonight's class is going to be less of a class. I'm going to speak a little bit off the cuff about some things, and then we're going to watch a video. It's a teaching. It's a guy who I've been very inspired by, and we're going to do a 30-minute, so you can hear him speak, and it's basically, he sort of uses everything we've learned and everything we've talked about, spent, an hour each week on it, and he basically hits on all these points in like 30 minutes in his message. So I know like Mark Westinghouse asked me a bunch of times about like, well, what's the point of that? How can I use this? And I think this video shows a good example of how it's just like he can make these points quick, and if you know this stuff, you can just sort of rip it out. But again, you need to have the base study of it. You need to have a knowledge of it so you can reach for it. So if you remember, we were talking about the problem of pain and suffering. We talked about what was like, we had the intellectual problem, and we sort of covered that. You know, if you remember, it's the logical problem of pain. Basically says, because suffering exists, it is impossible for all-powerful, all-living God to exist. And we talked about basically how that's, you know, not really a contradiction. I gave many reasons why the two could exist. And then I sort of mentioned the probabilistic version of suffering. And I'm going to just do this real quick, because basically what that says is that because of the suffering in the world, because there is suffering in the world, you know, yeah, like God could exist, but it's highly improbable that he exists. So it's based on a probability. It's saying that, you know, because look at all the suffering, look at all like natural disasters, look at all the wars, look at all these things that happen, you know, and if there was an all-loving, all-powerful God, like he would stop it. So the fact that he's not stopping it means that he probably doesn't exist. Now, the thing about probabilities is that it's based on background knowledge. Like you base a probability off information you have. So probabilities can change. So when you say this, you're using just one thing to base the probability or improbability of God's existence. So I could say to you, for example, a good example of this is, say 90% of college students drink alcohol. So this guy Brian's a college student. So you would say, oh, it's probable that Brian drinks alcohol based on that information. But then you could add the information, say, oh, Brian's a college student at a religious college, and in these religious colleges, only 10% of students drink alcohol. And then just like that, the probability completely changes. So again, like when you're talking about probabilities, this is something to consider. And when people look at this and use this as a reason not to like believe in God, they're sort of not looking at the whole picture. You know, based on just a probability, I could say there is a lot of suffering in the world, but a majority of the world, I would say, are living happy lives. I mean, the suffering gets all the news and all the headlines, but if the world was dominantly a miserable place, like why not everybody just commit suicide? You know, if the human race has flourished, the human race continues to flourish, even with all the suffering that happens, even with all these things that go on. So I can say the balance of good may be better than the balance of suffering. I'm not talking about a moral good. I'm talking about like living a good, healthy life. And as time continually passes, like the quality of life goes up. And yes, there is a lot of inequality in the world. But again, if you remember last week, I talked about free will. And much of the suffering is caused by our free will and what we do to other people. And you may hear the claim, well, you know, we don't cause hurricanes. However, much of the pain caused by hurricanes could be based on a sort of moral thing done by a society. You know, you look at natural disasters affect poor countries way more than they affect, you know, rich countries. And I'm not here to say that like, oh, America should do more. It's not even that. It's that a lot of times in these poor countries you have corrupt politicians who don't spend the money to help their infrastructure, build up their infrastructure. So even like natural disasters, the impact can be limited much more by, you know, good moral decisions. So again, it's like to say that morality or goodness doesn't play into all of suffering. Like you can still see that there's an element of suffering. So, as I said, probability, it runs into the same problem that the logical one does. And like I said, I don't want to get too deep into it. And if you remember on my worksheet, I talked about the third sort of issue was what I call the emotional problem of pain. And this is something that I think is the predominant motivation for holding suffering against a belief in God. There is an atheist writer, philosopher, Michael Ruse, who he's one of my favorite atheists. I like reading them. He's a very honest atheist. He actually has said in many interviews, and he's written, that he thinks that the theists and the Christians have the better arguments. He's like, they win the arguments. He's like, he says his side relies on science, and he says that science falls short in answering so many of these fundamental questions. But then asked, like, why then is he an atheist? He basically says is that he doesn't want to believe in a God that would allow any suffering. He says, if God exists and there's like a child who's dying, he's like, I want that God to stop it. And he's like, I refuse to believe in a God that wouldn't stop it. Again, I talked about there could be innumerable overriding reasons, one of which is a lot of times the reason a child is suffering is because someone else who has free will is doing something to that child. And like, God has created us free. So that's tough, but the bigger issue of suffering is no matter what worldview we think of, or worldview you are, or worldview you look at, like, this is a problem for every single one. This is a question that everyone has to deal with, struggle with, answer, experience. I mean, we've all experienced suffering. It is one of the absolutes of being human, I think, is that at some point or another you're going to suffer. And each individual, it's very, very strong to that person. You might say, like, oh, that person's not really suffering, but you're not experiencing what they're experiencing. Everyone experiences intense suffering at some point in their life in some form or another, whether it be emotional, mental, physical, something you can look out in the world and say, like, we are all in this together. We all suffer. We all experience it. And so how do these other worldviews answer it? How do they answer this question? How do they deal with this? And to me, and in my own life, I found the best answers in Christianity. I found the best response to my own suffering in Christianity. Christianity tells us that God himself became a man. Like, he became a human just to be just like us. And so, you can struggle with all these things like, God, why don't you stop this suffering? God, why do you let this happen? Why did you let this happen to me? Why did you let me go through this? Why did I have to deal with this? And, you might not get the answers to that, but one thing that Christianity does that no other religion has done is that God, in becoming man in Jesus Christ, can relate to your suffering. That no other worldview, no other belief has either a God or a non-God that gives you that kind of answer. Christ bore the suffering. He knows what it's like when we suffer. He's experienced the suffering. So he's there with us when we're suffering. And they're not here. A couple of people asked me, like, why I'm a Christian, why I became a Christian. So I'm going to sort of talk about that a little bit. I think some people might be interested in that, some people might not be. But I was raised in a Christian home. My parents are in the back, for those who don't know. And it wasn't, it was basically non-denominational Christian, independent, like this church. John. Okay. And my parents were amazing parents. And I love them very much. I couldn't ask for better parents. Without them, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be standing up here. I wouldn't be doing this class. Who knows where I'd be. But, so many you look out in the world and, like, so many families, are broken. So many kids have no parents. And, I'm eternally grateful for my parents and what they did and how much they loved me. But again, as I said, each person sort of walks their own walk. And as I said about suffering, everyone experiences suffering and no one else can experience that person's suffering. I couldn't just become my parents. Like, I wasn't just, because they raised me Christian, it didn't mean I was like a Christian. And, they did their best and they did a great job. Like, they couldn't have done anything different. And as I become an adult, I realized that, not a lot changes when we become adult. When I was younger, I thought like, oh man, being an adult, like, what's that like? I'm gonna think so differently. I mean, and you do in some ways, but you're still you. Like in my head, I'm still like a 13-year-old kid, Like I can't imagine. It's like, and that's when I look back at my parents, like, they're just, my dad's that 13-year-old kid trying to raise a kid, he's just winging it, Not necessarily, excuse me, not necessarily winging it, but I realize that you don't become an age and then all of a sudden you have all the answers. And so things can happen, and my parents did their best, and they didn't really make any mistakes, I don't think. But it's hard to say. I don't know when I would call myself, I became a Christian. A lot of people have these moments where it's like, I was a Christian, like I had this moment, this salvation moment, or this moment where I believed and then I didn't believe. Paul in the Bible, that's a great story where Christ revealed himself to him and there it was. I relate more to C.S. Lewis. If you've read his story, he calls himself the most reluctant convert to Christianity. I mean, I don't think I'm as reluctant as he was, because he didn't become a Christian until he was late in his life, but he talks a lot about how he felt like he was riding a bike away from God, and God was just like endlessly pursuing him until finally C.S. Lewis like basically got too tired and gave in. In many ways, that sort of relates to me. I accepted it. Like I went to church and I was like, okay, this is like, I go to church, I guess this is true. This is what I'm supposed to believe. But, there was nothing in me that made it a belief. It was a surface thing. I think you see a lot of people in these big churches, I don't want to necessarily call them Catholics, but, you have the people just go on Sunday and it's part of ritual. It becomes a ritual in your life. Sort of that's what it was for me. And I went to a Christian school when I was younger, and like that's, you get a big dose of suffering when you go to school. But for me, it was more like, here I am in this Christian school, and as any person knows, that growing up, like kids are cruel. Like it doesn't matter if they're Christian or non-Christian. And that's what I mean. Humans are the same way. When I look at Christianity, the doctrine of the fallen state of man, it's like I see it everywhere. You see it in yourself. You see it in children even. And, I went to a Christian school, and I was a quiet kid. I was a shy kid. But, the mind I have now, I think, began then. And I had questions, but I kept them to myself because I was afraid. When you go into a school like that, everything is just prescribed to you. It's like, this is the way it is. This is the way it is. And I have a very strong memory in 4th grade where this girl fell. I'm not going to name any names. This girl fell we're on recess. This girl fell and like viciously twisted her ankle. Teacher ran over. All the kids ran over. And the teacher was just like, Ben, you have to pray for her right now. And I was just like, what? And she was like, start praying. And I was like, I don't know what to say. And then she told me, she was like, just start praying. And I just said like, I started saying like, oh, I hope her legs get better. And then she was like, no, you have to pray in tongues. I didn't know. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know if I believed any of this. And that like really stands out to me. Like I didn't know what to do. And then I was afraid. I was afraid to say no. I was afraid to say like, what is praying in tongues? Like I didn't even know what it was. So that sort of started like these questions in my mind. And then I left Christian school and went to a public school. And another big pain happened is that all my friends from Christian school I basically like lost touch with. Like I didn't have any of my friends. I was in a public school alone. And it was tough. And I'm not saying like cry me a river. I'm just saying like, you're raised, I was told all these things about God, but I was like, where's God? Here I am alone in this school. And it's just like, I just want to make friends. I just don't want to be alone. And I did. I made friends, and all this stuff happened, and they believe different things than me, and it was just like, oh, you know, these people, but they're my friends, and they're nice to me, and they're not Christians, so like, what does this mean? So, long story short, I'm kind of rambling. I want to get to the crux of it. When I was 16, I fell in love, quote unquote, fell in love. That was like, and that was it. That was like, nope, it's not Christianity. This is it. This is what I was made for. This is what my life to be. This is everything. Like, this relationship is it. Like, I'm going to get married. I'm going to be with this person. I'm going to have a happy life. That's it. 2 years later, that was not it. At all. So, that ended very badly, and this is something I've never told anyone. It's kind of tough with my parents here. When it happened, it wasn't like thought out or anything, but a couple people know, Adam will know. We lived in Berkeley Heights, and there's a road that basically goes all along Berkeley Heights called Simmons Drive, and then there's the cemetery there at the end. And if you know, there's sort of like a halfway house all the way at the end of Simmons Drive towards the Saugerty side. So basically, when I had my heart crushed, I decided in a spur of the moment that I was going to drive my car into that tree. And the Simmons Drive, I floored it. I was just going to go drive my car into this tree. I didn't know what was going to happen. It wasn't like a thought-out suicide plan. It was just like, I'm going to drive my car into this tree. Car hit about 75 miles an hour. I was by the cemetery. My car just stopped. Just died. Sorry. It just died right next to the cemetery. Turns out like the alternator was bad. I had a red Nissan. I don't know, my dad, I had to push the car home. I don't know, my parents even remember. I pushed the car home. But again, that wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be a Christian now. It wasn't anything like that. But, you know, my life could have taken a very different turn if I had driven into that tree. So again, fast forward, I probably 19, 20, I'm in college, started taking philosophy class, and just like sort of bombarded with all this stuff. And like I said, I just sort of soaked it in, didn't have any answers. For all, you know, intents and purposes, I was probably sort of like an atheist, I think. Like I said, it's all well and good for people to live this way. I think it's like I would live this way. If I had kids, I'd probably bring them to church, but like it's just to help people live better lives. It doesn't actually like mean anything, you know. So I used to work in a lab at the school, and if you remember, some of you may not know, but this was when Napster was big, and Napster was like a way to download music. Like it was like the original downloading music, and it was all free. And how it worked is that people would like, if you had a CD, you'd put it in your computer, and you'd upload all the songs off your CD and onto this website, and then someone else could just search it and then download the songs off. But it wasn't any, like it wasn't the company Napster downloading these songs. It was like, it's called music sharing, file sharing. So people would share files. And I was in this lab, and I just basically had to be in the lab to keep it open. And if people had questions, I would answer. But I would just go on Napster, download music. I had like 160 CDs, like free music. And I don't remember the quote unquote album I searched for, but I was downloading this one album. After class, I put it in my car, I started playing it, and it wasn't music. It was this man talking. Sounded like he had an accent. This guy's name is Ravi Zacharias, and he's the guy we're going to watch tonight. And he just had all these answers to these questions I had. You know, like, how do you know God exists? What are some evidence that God exists? Someone had uploaded the file under a different name. I don't know. That's what I think. And starting then, I just dug. I just started researching all this stuff, all this, like, you know, Billy, you asked me like how I got into it. It was just like it was sort of self-taught. Started reading all his books. I changed my minor to philosophy. I was taking philosophy classes, reading books, listening to all this stuff. And sort of along that path, like C.S. Lewis said, there wasn't like a moment. It just sort of like I went from a moment of like, I don't know if I believe this, to this makes a lot of sense, to I think I believe this stuff. And now to the point where I do believe it. And going back through my life and looking at all those moments of pain I had and talking about what I talk about in suffering, I know that God and his son, Jesus Christ, were with me in every single one of those moments. Something that sticks with me is that in the Bible it says, like, because I live, you too shall live. And I know that all the pain I experienced, like, he experienced it with me. And I don't have, like, you know, an argument for that. It's just something I know. This philosopher Alistair McGrath asked, like, how do you know, like, God exists? Like, how do you personally know? Like, they didn't ask him for an argument. And I think I've said this quote before, and he says, the same way I know that my mom exists, like, because I have a relationship with my mom. It's like I talk to God, and I know he's there. And that's the simplest way I can put it. It's like I've come to the point where it's in that process of, like, researching all this stuff, I just started talking to God. Like, just, it was weird. I didn't even think that maybe I was talking to God to begin with, but I just started talking to him. And, you know, we have all these institutions, not us here per se, but there's all these institutions built up by religion that I think are meant to get in your way, to separate you from God. You know, as I talked about early in the Catholic Church, when the Bible was only in Latin, and, like, the common man couldn't read the Bible, because, like, no, you have to come to us if you want to get to God. And that is the exact opposite of the way God is, the way Christ is. Every other religion is like that too, for the most part. You know, you have to do these things. You have to do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and then you can talk to God. But then he might not even really be listening, you know. Or your life is just an illusion if you're a pantheist. Your pain is just an illusion, you know. In Islam, Allah doesn't really care about you, but you have to do all this stuff because it's what you're supposed to do. So I want to play a 30-minute video of Ravi Zacharias. Like I said, watch it in sort of a different way. You know, look for some of the things we've gone over, like the way he sort of uses them. This is the shortest sort of video of him I could find. Some of you may have heard this message before, some of you may not. If not, I apologize. But, you know, just look at the way he uses his information, and he can basically go through these arguments in like 2 lines sometimes, and just, like, you don't need to have like this big background. You don't need to go, oh, you want to have this conversation? Let's have an 8-hour conversation. Like, you don't need to do that. So that's it. I'll talk again maybe for a couple of minutes after the video. So, and then, like, yeah, we'll do some questions after the video.
Eastern spirituality because it's Eastern in modern garb. I was born and raised in India, in Delhi. My ancestors came from the highest.
All right, so again, I want to thank everybody that came to the, especially Bill, because you didn't miss one. You know, perfect attendance right here.
Do I get a star?
Yes, I just don't have one. So yeah, if you haven't circled the sheet, you can give it to me at a later date. If you have, hand it in to me. Before I end, I guess no comment, but does anybody have like any question about maybe anything we talked about this whole last couple months that maybe I didn't answer, that you want an answer to, or would like to discuss? It's getting kind of late, so hopefully nobody has a question. That was 2 years ago.
What's the capital of North Dakota?
Whew.
Bismarck? Bismarck. Yeah, I think.
Okay.
All right.
Not good at geography. I'm pretty good at philosophy, not geography. Does Bismarck really exist, or is it an illusion? I've never been there, so maybe it's not real. All right, thanks, guys.